Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So this is Ashwin Mehta, and I'm an AI and technology specialist in the learning and human capital industry. And I'm joined today for the second time by Jacqui Woodall. Jacqui, welcome.
Hi Ashwin. Nice to be here again.
Great to have you back. So we were talking last time, and we were going to talk this time about AI in the legal sector. So last time we were talking about kind of the high-level approach that is very similar across, I would say, pretty much all sectors, and that is thinking about strategy, thinking about things like disruption and disruption to the industry, but also things like workforce displacement and how jobs might be affected by the implementation of AI across lots of different use cases. And that leads us to think about various aspects like culture, like change management. And last time we were touching on the idea of cultural inertia in organizations. So we have power structures and power hierarchies that maybe don't fully accept the disruption or they try and bottleneck the disruption. We have things like risk management, which by necessity need to slow down things like disruption and make sure that they're appropriately managed in terms of data and security and impacts and all of these things. But that leads us down a path where we start to think about change and we start to think about change management. And in the L&D space and in the human capital space, which is mainly where I guess I operate and you operate as well, we have seen this trajectory over the last year or so where we've had disruption to things like content production, disruption to things like platform implementations, license models, copyright, and all of these things have been slightly disrupted. And that causes conversation, but it also causes pilot programs to start and people to start to invest in exploring the area and thinking about experimentation, and new products come onto the market and everybody goes to test them out. So we have a SaaS landscape, which software as a service landscape, which is growing. So we have new capabilities, and we have new capabilities in our technical infrastructure via companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, AWS. So we have this massive change. The market is changing, the technical environment is changing, people's skill sets are changing, and the tool sets that we have and the capabilities that we have, all of this basically leads to change. And change is, a big scary word. So when I think of change in an organizational setting, I always think of, well, change is something we need to manage. We need to think about it. We need to make sure that it's disruptive to the extent that we get results, but not so disruptive to the extent that we get the negative effects of that disruption across the workforce. So how have you seen change manifest in your work in the legal sector, and how have you seen change being managed effectively?
Okay, brilliant question. Thank you very much. Yeah, so just a reminder that my specialism is in change management for the legal sector, although I have an HR background. So that's just important to note that I'm coming at this very much from a human-centric behavioral change management specialism. And yes, this is something that's in desperate need within the legal sector, whether we talk about private practice law firms or sort of teams of general counsel legal teams within corporations and businesses. They're all being affected by all of these massive changes at the moment. So this is particularly relevant. And, we talked about all of these different changes. What is absolutely necessary is a change in mindset and a change in skill set around how people are led through all of these changes. It is the only constant. That's I don't want to be, just throwing it out there like such a cliche, but it is really the only constant. And so the trouble is the pace and the volume of change is such that people genuinely are overwhelmed. And so we have this situation where, it cannot be denied the level of change that's happening. Now what we're seeing is an increased impetus on actually hiring people like change managers. We're seeing an interest in multidisciplinary skill sets where people can really delve into, how can we make a meaningful impact on the structured way in which we move people towards a state of seeing these disruptions as potential opportunities rather than simply, this is something being done to me. And that's essentially the bit that I love. I love finding a way to turn disruption into opportunity and helping leaders do that. So I suppose your question was about good use cases. What does good look like? I will start by just talking about what good is in terms of the methodology. I'm ProSci certified. ProSci is the body of change management professionals who really, they're the largest body that does research on seeing what actually really works within big corporations in terms of good change management. And they have an approach which really you look at both organizational change management and you look at individual change management, or what it takes to shift an individual, and then look at it at a larger macro level. They need to be looked at differently, but the most important framework that I think ProSci go out there and talk to in the world is the ADKAR framework, which most of the law firms, most of the big four, everybody uses it as their kind of baseline level of, how are we doing good change management? And without wanting to just go through, all these acronyms and throw them out at people, I do think that the ADKAR framework is probably the one that most resonates with me as well, because it looks at the individual. What does it take to shift an individual from a place of fear and uncertainty to then moving them to a place where they're seeing an opportunity and can actually do something with the change that they're confronted with? So taking them from that state, they start with awareness, then move to desire. There's a lot of controversy about why we should use the word desire, because a lot of people are not going to get to a point of desire. They've sort of changed that, and they've taken it to moving them from awareness to then a commitment. So do I have a commitment? For whatever reason, have I made that shift to committing to what this thing means and how I'm going to play a part in it? Then, really truly having knowledge about what this change actually means. That's where the training starts, but the ability is then cemented by proper training and proper collaboration around what this change is actually going to be, and a sense of involvement in it. And then, of course, moving to the point of, and that's ability is usually when the go live happens. If we're talking about a technology implementation, it would be at that point of go live. You have to make sure that people have reached that state of ability. Then we move to reinforcement and what all of that amazing work around success stories and cementing, the fact that we're celebrating the wins, etc., and really tracking how people are actually adopting change. And there is new technology, AI-powered technology, that also looks at that at the moment now, which has really supercharged the way we can do that reinforcement bit. So I just want to, first of all, highlight what excellent change management from a structured change management perspective looks like. I have certainly seen that be used increasingly within law firms. What they're doing is they're taking various segmented stakeholders, really identifying what drives them, what motivates them, and what's in it for me as a particular type of stakeholder, and then chunking down these different buckets of people, and then understanding what is it that they need, what are the deliverables, what are the types of communication, what are the things that they need as interventions that are going to shift them across this whole set of stages. And I have seen that be professionalized and be dealt with on a much more structured basis with proper communication plans. Obviously, I've been the one doing it alongside these leaders. And I think the more emphasis is put on that sort of thinking, it is very helpful, because at the very least, when you hear people say, well, we're all individuals, you can't just be segmented and put into these groups, these buckets, we're not just, labels. Of course, they're not. But otherwise, what you get if you don't try and segment your audience and understand what the broad drivers are, you end up with a one-size-fits-all approach that really doesn't shift people as a large group, because we've all got such, personalized needs around how we want to be communicated with. So this ties in with a larger trend around personalization, which AI is helping us with massively. Everybody needs a more customized and personalized approach to the delivery of a user experience. And the same thing is happening in how we approach change management and how we try to communicate with people. We are having to personalize our statements and our interventions that help people along that journey. So I hope that answers your question. Broadly speaking, that was the kind of use case that was applied to almost every change that I've been doing.
Yeah, I've got a couple of high-level thoughts on that. So first thing is, the ADKAR method is, I guess, to some degree, very widely used. I've always had this thought, and I've never really had a chance to talk about it, but this is our chance. Let's have a chat. So
yeah.
When we think about the decision, we have either a desire or awareness, or not desire or awareness. We have desire or commitment, which is the person making a decision. So this is the formation of intent. Mm-hmm. I have the intent to go along with this change. And from my background, I was researching technology adoption, which is the technology acceptance, which is the formation of intent, which is the precursor to behavior.
Yes. So I like
Now,
better language, yeah.
So if we think about that formation of intent, the difficulty that I have with the ADKAR model is nearly always that we say that knowledge, understanding the details of what the change needs to be, comes after the formation of intent. And that seems the wrong way round for me, because you can be aware of something but not really know the details. But how can you commit to a course of action without knowing the details? Where I've seen this work in practice, I've seen the decision-making and the knowledge cycle basically be iterative. So we're releasing more information, we're putting efforts into our communication approach, we're making sure that we do some kind of user training and building the skills so that people can be informed. And when people are informed, then you go down this track of effectively informed consent, whether it's data collection or whether it's something else. But we have informed consent, and that then forms this intention to go along with the change process. So just, asking you to reflect a little bit on that.
Answer to that, because it's a fabulous question. And it's been my concern as well that, really good change management use cases where I've seen detractors or people who are quite resistant actually shift has been only at that point where they truly start to understand and have full knowledge of the system and are brought in with the level of detail that sometimes is only planned later. The way ProSci have, whether they've changed up or not, I know that the most recent way in which they do their training is that they do say it is not linear. So it doesn't have to be linear. And it may be that you might need to apply the different phases at different times for different audience groups. So the most obvious ones there you can't change the reinforcement and the fact that awareness needs to start at the beginning and reinforcement at the end. But for some people, they need to dive straight in, and you won't actually get their full buy-in until that point at which they've been truly brought in and made aware of the full details, at which point it becomes really gnarly, because there are some people who'll be like, well, I wasn't consulted. This isn't the right way. We shouldn't be doing it this way. We shouldn't, which is the tension with, when I've seen, big implementation partners from the Big Four being brought in, and there's this tension between change management teams saying, well, we need to really bring some of these people involved. We need to get them involved. We need to get them into the validation sessions or the even pre-validation. We need to get more people involved. There's always this tension because they're saying, well, if we get too many voices, then it becomes too difficult, So some of it is done by stealth, it is honestly the way it's done. And then people are ending up in a position where they're having to accept what the out of the box thing is that has been agreed. I don't think there's really an easy way of getting around that, because sometimes it has to do with the way in which implementations are decided upon, where they know they're going to have a lot of resistance and they're going to implement certain things, and then people are going to have to grapple with it. But I do think that where we've made a specific intention as a change management team to bring certain resistors in early, give them more knowledge and really get them involved, that actually shifts things most. And that's to your point about you can't just do it in a linear fashion for some people. You can't take big groups and apply exactly the same linear approach to each of them. I'm very much a fan of mixing it up and changing it up and bringing in whatever's actually going to help people move within their kind of segment. What is it? Is it a focus group? I'm a big fan of focus groups, because you really get a bunch of people in the room together who, when they are the representative of a particular type of segment and they're voicing that, they then get the opportunity to hear from other sides around what is the other aspect of this, what's the other lens that we need to bring to it. And then they start to understand the slightly richer picture of it. So, to me, one of the most important kind of interventions to use is the focus group, but it needs to be run really well. It needs to be really well thought through and facilitated extremely well. But that's gold dust for, that's where I think you start to really shift people's minds and you start to get them feeling that sense of commitment, that kind of moment of intent. They still might not be happy with every aspect of it, but they're starting to engage and they're starting to accept, and then actually make an important step in their minds to say, I'm going to be involved in this.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And having the difference between waterfall and agile effectively in the approach.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, lots of change management bodies are I mean, there's so much that shifting and changing, where even agile is now being criticized as being, you can't just, lift and shift agile into certain environments and expect it to work. It needs all of the right infrastructure and all the right buy-in in order for agile to work. So yeah, I'm also sort of specialized in agile change management. But again, it becomes very complex when you try to apply a mix and match. Yeah, it's difficult. But essentially, there is a trend towards a more agile approach of meeting people where they are and applying whatever intervention is actually going to shift that group to the next level or to the next sort of stage of commitment.
Yeah, which implies there are stages of commitment, right? Because
yeah.
So change, I've looked at change in a couple of different areas, but change either at a strategic level. So we're looking at when we need to move the organization from a current state to a target state, and we need to have a roadmap of activities, projects, a portfolio of things that we need to do to move from A to B, because the organization wants to be at this target state B, and there are things that need to happen to get there. Then there is the intervention stage. So we have a roadmap of interventions, and that's high level, that's change. The roadmap itself is a change. But then each intervention itself is an iterative change. It's a micro change. It's happening in a particular area, in a particular department, with a particular user group. And in an ideal world, the entire organization goes on this roadmap and eventually gets to where it wants to be. So when we look at each of these little changes, these in the learning and development and the human capital space, these would be the small interventions where we say we're going to deploy a particular bit of software. We're going to develop a chatbot or a virtual agent. We're going to buy a particular platform and embed that and implement it. So there might be these different stages that make up this journey. When we pivot slightly and think about the legal sector specifically, because that's what we're talking about, and last time when we were having this discussion, we were talking about things like document analysis and things like data analysis and getting through the drudgery of sifting through lots of boxes of data and looking at a particular case and thinking about what the case law out there is. And we talked about all of these kinds of things. Contracting, I think we talked about as well. But what are the big use cases that you're seeing in your client base in the legal sector when it comes to AI? Because there are going to be some that are tried and tested and kind of everybody's using these use cases. And there are going to be some that are emerging, and the potential future of work for the legal sector might be disrupted or changed by the emerging use cases. So what are the kinds of things you're seeing?
Okay, there are so many. So the most obvious ones that come to mind, if we look at the way in which law firms are engaging with large language models, there's been a huge, the one that I'm most familiar with is looking at Harvey. So Harvey, it's a startup that just went to absolute success with certain big names taking on exclusive partnerships with it, where essentially it's helping all the lawyers to be able to engage safely with a large language model that they have decided has been trained in the right ways to be able to spit out the right kind of information that's not going to, hallucinate or whatever.
So this is the GPT for law,
it's
kind of.
GPT for law, and that's oversimplifying it, but essentially it's GPT for law. But saying that, lawyers are using Copilot as well. For those that are within the Microsoft stack, but the ability to use a lawyer-trained large language model, that's Harvey. Please don't, let me oversimplify it just in that sense. But if you want to be really crude about it, it's that. But then there are other forms of AI-powered tools for document review, or there's other types of tools, whether it be HiQ, there's Kira. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just aware of these tools being used. And I'm aware of the teams that have been trying to implement it and trying to work with these tools. So there's that. And then there's so many different types of new startups around contract drafting, contract automation. There's contract management platforms that have been also proliferating and doing lots to bring AI-powered elements into tools that have been around for a long time as well. There's new tools for due diligence as well. So due diligence is something that they've been trying for a very long time to really make some strides in the way in which it's done. It's actually been quite hard to do that, because what you really need for that to work incredibly well is the lawyers to spend the time in training very specifically what needs to go into these models. And it can be very complex, but there's been great strides made in that. And there's new startups proliferating. I've just seen another one, Wordsmith AI, that's just come out on the market. So there's teams, for example, that I helped to implement the launch of a new center of excellence for due diligence. Now, that center of excellence was all about how can we use multidisciplinary experts and the new AI-powered technology in order to supercharge the way due diligence is done and make it smarter, faster, leaner in the way that we do it for our clients. Now, that is just an example of, those are just some use cases, right? So, and then there's also other ways in which there's a lot of shaking up happening in the legal market around just access to justice with types of AI-powered tools that are able to really help, looking at case law, the construction of arguments. I actually also know of somebody who just managed to use just ChatGPT to win a case against an insurance company, and they didn't use a lawyer. So there's also this element of some people out there, obviously the more maverick types, who are trying to take on the powers that be and sometimes winning with the use of just straight up ChatGPT.
Free tools, yeah.
Yeah, free tools, exactly. So this just gives you a little example. I've just touched on a tiny element of it, but there's Disco, there's so many different ones that are looking at document review. Document review is one of the most obvious ones because that, really lends itself to large volumes of data that we manage. They still need their 1LR, 2LR, so they need their first and second line reviews, and they need to have the lawyers involved in actually overseeing what's going on here. But there's a lot of work involved, whether it be legal project managers, legal process specialists, legal technologists, and also legal analysts coming into the fore, where they are not lawyers traditionally, but they are really coming in to absolutely help orchestrate large volume cases and matters in a much more different way that can mean it can be much more cost effectively managed for clients. So that's just one aspect. And I would say that the legal teams within large corporations are the ones that are most engaging those lawyers who are general counsel and legal teams within big, I'd say FTSE 500 kind of companies. Those are the ones that are doing the most exciting new work in one sense, because they are having to actually engage with these tools, hands-on, because they're being asked to take on brand new ways of doing things so that they can reduce their spend on external private practice law firms. So I'd say there is this slight change. You got lawyers who are on the ground in legal teams in big companies, maybe even also small companies, really grappling with new tools themselves and having to. And, there's an increase in the amount of spend on AI-powered tools. And then you've got the law firms where things are a bit more tentative, and they've got things in specific teams where people are piloting things, but they're still pretty much doing the bread and butter like they used to. Yeah.
So if we split that up a little bit, so we have, of course, one of the points you made is having a human in the loop to verify the outputs of whatever AI tooling that we're using. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I'm seeing across pretty much every sector. The other way I'd like to split this up is you have, if we take like a five forces lens, like we have the things that everybody can do, or there's a very low barrier to entry. So if I've got a business, it's a legal business, and I can go and buy a tool for whatever the license cost of a particular tool is, and I can implement it into my business by enterprise license or a team license or something like that. The cost is relatively low, and it doesn't necessarily add to the competitive advantage of my business if everybody can go and buy it, because it's a generic capability for the sector. So I can do that, and it might give me some efficiency. So one category of AI tools in pretty much any sector is what you can buy easily. Software as a service, you can just get it off the shelf. You don't need to customize it. It's just there, you can use it. And when we have publicly available data sets, like the regulatory environment, for example, that we have in the UK, you can go and find all of the statutory instruments. To some degree, you could say that public domain data is there, and there are SaaS tools available, so you can just buy them or you can use them for free.
Yes, and let me just say there's Thomson Reuters and there's LexisNexis and there's all of their kind of new, easy AI-powered ways of accessing their big body of knowledge as well now for lawyers.
Sure. So that's one category, and that doesn't set aside any particular law firm from any other particular law firm, because they all have access to basically the same things for a little bit of money. The second category of things would be where you do any company, again, it doesn't have to be the legal sector, but where you're doing bespoke development of something that adds to your competitive advantage, and therefore you stand out in the market because you're doing something that's different to what everybody else is doing. And this is moving away from the idea of using generic tools to doing something that is specialist. And the use cases that we've covered so far have been in the SaaS space, so things that everybody can do. And if we just take the idea of, so retrieval augmented generation is one of those things where you could say you're using AI, but you're using it on company data. So you're doing something that other companies can't necessarily replicate. It's not the AI, it's the data.
Yes,
can't easily be replicated. But if we look at that space where we're talking about companies trying to build a competitive advantage, trying to stand out from the crowd, trying to have a USP in the market, are there any use cases for AI in that space? Are you seeing a lot of companies pilot things, develop things, do things that are special?
Yes, we're at the early burgeoning stages of it, and there is a lot of money and investment being put into how are we utilizing some of these tools, and then how are we creating our own chatbots, how are we creating our own large language models, and our own tools, so that we can somehow look to productize and commodify the knowledge that we are sitting on, the data that we have, and our own intellectual property. Now, that is definitely something that every large global law firm is trying to do. What I know is that it's proving very tricky, primarily because it's very hard to get the right level of engagement with those lawyers who can really shift the dial in actually making them meaningful, to spend the time collaborating with the technologists in order to create something that's actually, going to really work. That is the key problem, and the main problem there is the same thing that I mentioned in the first session that we had, which is freeing up time from the billable hour. And so there is this real tension. And if you're looking at, so I can't tell you about the amazing cases yet that I've seen. I think Ellen and Overy seems to be doing a great job at really working with partnerships and starting to create some really interesting new tools. I have definitely seen smaller use cases within other law firms that I've worked at where there are some partnerships that are working really well for smaller aspects. But in terms of really commodifying what is our intellectual property, how are we then taking it out there to the market? I think there are some slightly smaller law firms that like Waitman's that are actually doing some really interesting things in commodifying and creating apps that are very useful for clients. That is something that I'm starting to see. There are some apps where the lawyers and the business process analysts and the technologists have come together, and they've created an app that has a spin on it that, it is based on the guidance from lawyers in their firm who really know what they're doing. And they've created a way of you being able to engage with the regulatory environment, and they are able to shift it and change it in real time. It's modular in the sense that it can always adapt to changes, and clients can then use these apps but it's not, these are for smaller use cases that I have seen. So far, I'm still waiting to see that sort of big bang where a law firm is able to say, well, here's a way of you paying for a service that can essentially, you can get a bot, you can pay for a bot that will give you the right level of kind of lawyer's opinion that's got our branded name on it.
That's interesting, because there are three levels to that, right? So the level one is effectively I can go to ChatGPT, Google, Copilot, something. I can go to a free, publicly accessible tool and get some level of legal advice. Or I can go to a hotshot lawyer and get the best signed-off advice, which has all of the contracting and risk governance and all of this stuff is taken care of. Or there's the middle ground where you say, well, I can go to an agent and it has been validated that it is correct by a law firm. And that's what we're
tricky area. Seeing a lot more of. There is an impetus always to disclose where some kind of output, some kind of documentation, a deliverable that is given to a client will have to say this has been created with the influence of AI tools. It'll have to have that stamp on
transparency.
it. Yeah. It is such a difficult environment though for law firms, because there are many big clients, especially in the banking and other regulated spaces, where it's becoming so difficult. But there are some clients that are saying, absolutely, we don't want any AI involvement in this. And that's becoming increasingly almost impossible to completely avoid, seeing as these tools are just everywhere.
And why is that? Is that a risk consideration, or is it just...
Yeah, there are. So I want to stress massively that I am seeing a complete disconnect between the pace and the rate and the sort of excitedness, the intensity with which the entire world is engaging with ChatGPT and AI-powered tools, compared to how certain large corporations, banks and other, big regulated bodies are, and sort of capitalist kind of machines are actually, they're not able to keep up in the way that they're providing the regulatory environment internally for engaging with these tools. And so there is just this blanket rule sometimes. And so that's where there's a real challenge. And that's where obviously the big four are still making its money with the human consultants for now. So I'd say that this is also one of the reasons law firms are more reticent to engage in some of the same ways that more nimble, smaller operations will, because they just have so many more considerations around how are we reassuring our clients that it's actually still the humans that are still completely behind this. That doesn't change the fact that most of the world is now operating with, this will have been influenced at least with by AI powered tools. And then there's going to be increasing levels of demand from clients around the use of them, because they will know that if you've used them, I will be paying less money. I will get more value for money.
Well, there is that expectation that if you're using these tools, it's scalable, and therefore the cost base should come down and the price point should come down. But there is also, let's face it, you've got to develop these tools sometimes. So it's not necessarily true that the price point should come down. Maybe the price point is the same because of, investment in software has a different model to time and materials.
Absolutely.
Advice. But you bring up a point that makes me think about a different point. That point is that you mentioned that legal firms have the structure and big four consulting firms have the structure as well. And the structure is effectively that you have senior people who have expertise. Under those senior people, you have teams that have various levels of expertise that are being developed as they work on projects. So it's a hierarchical structure. In that kind of structure, you have not only, I guess, in the legal sense, you have like associates, juniors, whatever the terminology is. In consulting, you have junior consultants. In large companies, you have junior folks who then work their way up to being managers, etc., etc. Now, that tier of people, I'm not saying always, but let's say that they are younger people, right? They are younger people who potentially have gone through the last few years in the sense of a pandemic. They've been remote working. They've been not very heavily socialized in the office. So they haven't got all of the social support that they need. Now they have AI to contend with as a potential competitor for the tasks and activities that they do in an organization. So that has a knock-on effect because, as you can see from my background, I play music, and one of the things that happened during COVID was a lot of the venues that used to put on local bands closed down and they didn't reopen. And if they closed and they didn't reopen, then you still have the big bands that fill the stadium, that kind of band.
Arenas, yeah.
But the groundswell, the young talent that's coming through doesn't have a place to play, so they're not coming through. Now, if we translate that analogy over to consulting, legal, corporate environments, we have the new generation of grads that are coming through, graduates, who potentially haven't been socialized in the office. They come back after a pandemic. Now they have AI competing for their roles as well. What is the potential future disruption or the potential future of work when we think about that almost that generation having these things to contend with in their work?
Now, that is a huge question. It's the most rich question. And it's obviously the question that's keeping a lot of boomer parents or actually millennial parents even awake at night. And I'm one of them. I have a 9-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old son. And I'm also looking at what's happening with the, other people in my sphere who are of that Gen Z generation coming into the workforce. Look, I don't have the answers to that, but what I do feel very strongly, because I do a lot of work looking at trends and what's going to be the right kind of skill set, for example, that's going to make kids today really set them up for success in a new workforce. Look, the truth is 50% of the jobs, I'm gonna say this wrong, but what I have heard and I do believe is that there are 50% of the jobs that our kids will be working in by the time they enter the workforce or haven't even been existed yet, aren't in existence yet. And so what we do know is that there will be much more of a gig economy. There will be much more of a sense of these marketplaces. I'm actually on a marketplace called Outlier where you can take on specific jobs where you help to train AI models using your specific skill set. And it's very task-based, for one unit of work, you'll get paid a certain amount of money. That sort of way of work is proliferating now. And the way of rating somebody's performance within that work is also becoming much more quantified and able to be rated and then able to... So a lot more transparency that's entering the marketplace. There's a lot more fractional work. So those are the sorts of things that I see as being huge trends, which mean that there's an awful lot around mindset that's growth mindset that is having to be worked through with young kids today. And every school does really bang on about growth mindset, which I'm glad they do because I think it's fabulous. But that's what they're going to need. They're going to need mindsets to say, okay, I don't know how to do this thing yet, but I'm going to go and figure it out, right? So it's those people who are genuinely curious and able to adapt to new environments that are going to be more successful. Saying that, there's also another thought leadership around, and this is from people like Dan Pink, who've done a lot of work around motivation, who talk about the skill set that's needed for tomorrow. And it's much more fine arts. It's much more around the humanities. It's much more around human empathy. And what are the things, and also talking about the ways in which we need to elevate certain types of what we've considered minimum wage jobs, where it be social care, nursing, the way in which we look after old people, the way in which we look after children, and the way in which we really privilege the way that their little brains need to be properly nurtured early on. And there's a whole new way of thinking around how it used to be that people would say, well, if you want your kid to succeed in life, you must get them around the idea that they're going to need to be good at maths, which is, I think, always a good thing anyway, if you try and encourage that in them. But you need to think about becoming an accountant or a lawyer, Those sorts of jobs are going to really stand you in good stead and make you secure in the world. It's those kinds of types of roles that are the most threatened in some way by especially generative AI type tools. So it's interesting, but what does it mean to be a really great accountant who can work with AI-powered tools? What does it mean to be a really great lawyer who can work with AI-powered tools? That's going to be the new world. Now, I actually don't subscribe to the thought that, they're all the lawyers are just going to be, those jobs are just going to be taken by robots. I do think that the type of work is going to shift. And there's going to be an increasing, especially in the real foreseeable future, for quite a long time to come, there will be this need for somebody who can help to be that concierge, that person who really smooths the path and weaves in the human connection through it all.
Absolutely.
So, I don't have all the answers.
It's a complex topic, but thank you so much for having the conversation around these things today. And for those of you who are watching, if you are watching, then links are going to be down below and tags and hashtags so you can find Jacqui if you want to have a follow-on conversation. Jacqui Woodall, thank you very much for the conversation today.
Thank you.